Well, hi, and welcome back. My name is Sheldon McLeod. This is Thinking Out Loud, presented to you here exclusively on the Saltwire Network. And, you know, it's a little bit cooler overnight, a little bit cooler in the mornings. And we all know what that means is, well, heating season is coming. And as a matter of course, I mean, if you're already struggling to meet your bills for rent, we know inflation has had a huge impact on our daily lives. In fact, numbers that were unprecedented as far as the increase. And what economists will tell you is that, well, yes, inflation may be slowing, but prices are still higher. It just means that they're not increasing as quickly. And of course, that just comes back to that ongoing issue, the longstanding story about wages and how much it costs to have an affordable wage, a living wage, as it's called, working for a living, not living to work. And the latest report from the folks at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives here in Nova Scotia has been produced and released. And I really wanted to take a second to welcome back Christine Saulnier. She is the Nova Scotia Director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And it's good to see you again, Christine.
Hi, Sheldon. Thanks very much for having me talk about this important issue.
And when we talk about, folks in a situation where the federal government says Monday is a holiday for government workers, the Nova Scotia government says they'll follow suit for people to pay tribute to the late Queen, Queen Elizabeth, and that schools and daycares will be closed. But it's up to employers to decide whether to keep their doors open. Just curious, before we talk about the report, how that sits with you.
Well, absolutely. These are some of the issues that we raise. It isn't just about the living wage rate and how much people are being paid by the hour. It is about working conditions and how many hours they get and whether they have access to things like paid holidays and paid sick leave. This holiday will be challenging for many businesses and very challenging for many employees. If the school is closed and their childcare center is closed, we know that means they will not be able to go into work. And so you're looking at one of your 5 days next week likely being unpaid. This is not a statutory holiday. Businesses don't have to pay it. So it really is, for some people, going to be just one more challenge in their work week next week and in their ability to pay their bills.
We've heard about the housing crisis for some time. Inflation has been unprecedented for many people in their entire working lives, the way that we've seen that the price of basic goods, the basic necessities increasing. This report reflects what you folks say is a living wage. How do you calculate that, first of all?
We use a budget. We actually have costs in a budget that cover all of the essentials that a household would need. We use a reference family to calculate it because that is the household where we cover at least a diversity of household needs. So you're talking shelter, food, clothing, all the household necessities that people get access to. And that is rare in any benchmark. I mean, minimum wage doesn't look at what actual costs are in communities. And then we also make sure that the wage covers, payroll, EI, CPP, taxes, and that we consider whether households get access to income from government. Part of our message is there's this partnership here. Absolutely, the Living Wage Report is a call to employers to pay a living wage, to increase their wages, to ensure that their workers are able to come to their work and not be stressed about paying their bills. But the other part of that is this gap that you're talking about. There's a gap between the costs and the income. For some people who have decent income, they are able to make decisions and choices and cover the increased costs. The increased costs matter to those for whom they don't have enough income to begin with. And now they're having to make even more difficult choices about that income that already was stretched too thin because they're not getting any additional income to cover those costs. And so here we are with this increasing gap for people. And the living wage really is telling us how big that gap is.
We have obviously talked in the past about these reports, this number, the amount that you need to earn in order for it to cover the bills. That is creeping up and it continues to increase. Obviously, since the production of this report, the federal government has said that it was going to increase double, if I'm not mistaken, the GST rebate check for some folks, that there will be some additional fund made available. Is there any way to know how that might impact or affect the numbers as they were presented back on the 7th of September?
It will have no impact, and here's why. One of the things we flag is how low the eligibility income is for GST credit. None of the living wage rates, that household income, nobody qualifies for GST credit any longer. When we first started, I think most of the regions actually, most of the communities we were calculating, and as we went along, did actually qualify. Halifax, I think, likely did not. Now we're at a level in which none of them would qualify. And that has to do with that eligibility level, which we flag. You know, none of the living wage rates since we started in 2015, nobody qualifies for Nova Scotia income supports, not the Nova Scotia Affordable Living Tax Credit, not the Nova Scotia Child Benefit. So there's a question here. So absolutely doubling the GST credit will help, no question. But I think we are stuck somewhere where governments are not really taking into consideration at what level of income is required to pay for the costs that are essential.
Well, then at the risk of being provocative, it almost sounds like you might agree with what Pierre Poilievre, the new CPC leader, said, which is it's a small increase for people who are struggling to pay their bills.
Well, it absolutely is a small increase for sure. I mean, the dental care, you know, those are other things that we talked about. So that gap between costs and income, you can tackle that in many ways. And part of our message to government is the income side, they could be helping a little bit on that side for sure, and on the cost side. And that's a good example of how government could be supporting. If we were expanding, I mean, imagine if we all had to pay for the $4 billion that costs us in public health care. And by all, I mean businesses. I mean, all of us out of our pockets. That would be a significant burden for so many people. But the reality is, so many people do pay out of their pockets for what they need in terms of their health, because our public health care has not been expanded to cover teeth and eyes and really mental health and so many other prescription drugs, so many other issues that really are essential. If we help there in that way, we are freeing up some money for other things like food. So there are ways that we can get at this, various ways. And so that definitely is one of them.
And again, not to make this political, but there are alternative budgets that are produced by the Center for Policy Alternatives that you as an organization say, this is how we would like to see government spend tax revenue. The Nova Scotia government announced, listen, after the end of the year, fiscal year, we said there was going to be a deficit, but in fact, we have a surplus. And it was almost over $900 million in surplus. So how did that align with the budget that the Center for Policy Alternatives had predicted or had created and drafted?
Well, you know, I'll give them a little bit of room in that there is some inability to predict exactly what's going to happen, but we had some sense back in March where things were going. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is a perennial problem that governments do, and that is they underestimate their revenue. And that is in their favor often. So you underestimate it and, oh, wait, you come out with a surplus instead of a deficit at the end of the day. Unfortunately, you know, it's not the debt holders that need money right now. And that's really what happens with that surplus. It's Nova Scotians who are really in dire straits. I was struck in seeing that the indebtedness of households has now risen to $1.81 of debt for every dollar of income that households take in. I mean, again, we use unprecedented. That's just unprecedented. And an indication that households have been trying to make up that gap between income and the costs. And part of that has been made up with debt. And that's, you know, that causes a lot of insecurity for them, but for the economy as well. It's not healthy to see that level of indebtedness.
The Living Wages in Nova Scotia 2022 report says wages in Annapolis Valley, $22.40, Cape Breton, $20, Halifax, $23.50, the Northern Region, $20.40, Southern, $22.50. All wages, we're looking at 5 to 8% in increases. But it looks like the gap is closing a little bit between geographic areas in Nova Scotia. What does this tell you?
Yeah, part of that story, like I look at Cape Breton, which had the largest increase in their living wage rate. They had the most significant increase in their rental costs. the story of the housing crisis has not just been a Halifax story, but it's certainly, we saw the kind of urgency of it, I think, first in Halifax, just population-wise and all of that. But what really came out in the living wage work is how much of a housing crisis there is across the province. And that's part of the reason why we're seeing the gap between the communities decreases the shelter costs. I mean, obviously shelter's still going up in Halifax, but it actually went up more in Cape Breton compared to last year's than it did in Halifax, according to the data that we have access to, of course. Mm-hmm. So there's that proviso. That's one of them. And then when you look at the other high cost items, so childcare, obviously we could have a whole conversation about that. It's definitely more expensive in Halifax, but food tends to be more expensive outside of Halifax. And of course, transportation costs are more expensive when you're living in rural and you're having to travel farther for just getting access to whatever it is you need on a daily basis. And of course, transportation increased significantly year over year given gas prices.
I noted off the top that this is an annual report, something that you folks have been doing for some years. You and I have spoken to this on many occasions, but I'm wondering if you're worried about fatigue and the fatigue of the media to hear this message, politicians to hear this message, people who go, yeah, we know it needs to be higher, it's not higher. How do you keep this top of mind? How do you make a difference with policymakers and employers when it sounds like, well, that gap is never going to be closed?
You said that since we've been calculating, the wage has gone up and up. Actually, there was one year where the wage went down. That was the year that the federal government fully introduced the Canada Child Benefit. And we incorporated it into the living wage, and the increase to the Canada Child Benefit covered the smaller increase based on cost of living. That actually happened one year, and we saw a slight decrease in the living wage rate. It is possible for us to actually get to a place where we narrow that gap and say, there's a little bit less on the shoulder of employers, perhaps. And the other side of why we do an annual update is because some people are actually using these numbers to pay their employees. And at the end of the day, that's really important. When we see a Halifax Regional Municipality incorporate this into procurement, meaning contract workers in Halifax, as contracts open up, will be paid a living wage, like that's a real impact. And there is now an obligation to ensure that that wage rate has integrity and is updated so that we know what's actually happening in terms of costs and in terms of all of the other things that we take into account.
We covered a lot of ground here and talked about the challenge with affordability. Is there anything else that we haven't talked about or touched on that you want to before we finish?
I think we really have had a great conversation that has touched on all of the key points from the report. My message is always that this is a partnership, and we need to always be connecting the dots. The benefits of paying a living wage can be reaped by employers as well. And I think that's important to underline as we talk about all of the challenges with employees not being able to afford their basics. It is important that we really understand that that has an impact on their employees, and those employees are purchasing their products and services. And we're all connected here. The impact that we've underlined again and again of having people struggling in our province has an impact on all of us, and especially those who are struggling.
Dr. Christine Saulnier, the Nova Scotia Director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives in Nova Scotia. Thank you again for your time.
Thanks, Sheldon.